Okay, where were we? We're all the way to the end talking about wound healing, how wounds actually heal. Okay, so you guys can hang on to your tests for now. I'll pick them up at the end of class. All right. So the very end of this chapter 6 integumentary system lecture. I just wanted to talk briefly, because this is a really important, obviously, physiological part of how we work, is that our skin can heal itself, which is pretty amazing how it does it. And the fact that it can do it over and over and over again, basically. So there's 3 basic stages. We'll imagine you got a cut while you're making dinner or something. You're chopping some carrots and you cut into your finger. So the 3 stages that occur in order are going to be the inflammatory phase, the proliferation phase, and then maturation or remodeling. So I'm going to talk about each of these in just a little bit of detail and kind of tell you what's happening mostly under the surface of your skin that you don't see after you stop bleeding. So the inflammation stage is basically where the severed blood vessels are allowing blood to flow into the cut. So here we have a cut down into the skin. You severed some blood vessels, and that's allowing blood to actually flow up to the surface of the skin. Along with the red blood cells, which are mostly what you're seeing, there's a bunch of white blood cells, which are really important in the immune system I've mentioned before. But an immunity response also occurs. So white blood cells and plasma flow into the area. Plasma has, brings along with it antibodies, clotting proteins. So not only are red blood cells going into the area, but you have this kind of antimicrobial reaction as well. Sorry. Okay, so lots of blood, different types of blood cells flowing into the area. That's the first part of inflammation. Then the blood clot starts to form. So we don't want to keep bleeding. The idea behind the blood clot is to keep further blood loss from happening, right? So the blood clot is sort of knitting the edges of the wound together. So it's keeping any more blood loss from happening, as well as keeping any foreign invaders out, essentially. So it kind of has a twofold purpose. That's going to form the scab that you'll see on top of your skin. Underneath all of that, there's all these specific type of white blood cells called macrophages. And I kind of imagine them, they're these little blue dots here, like little Pac-Men, going around basically digesting dead tissue and any other debris in the wound. So they are really important in kind of breaking down any of the dead tissue, and then also fighting off anything that's trying to come into the skin or any bacteria that made its way in before the scab kind of closed over. So macrophages are white blood cells. That's the end of the first stage, the inflammatory phase. The proliferation phase, there's a lot of stuff that's happening. So proliferation basically means more epidermal cells are being produced. So tissue regeneration. Your tissue is regenerating itself, so you don't continue to have a slice in your hand or whatever. So you have to actually regenerate that epidermal epithelial tissue to replace the previous basically gash that was in your hand, your finger. So there's quite a few pieces of the proliferation stage here, as you can see from all these bullet points. First, new capillaries are going to have to form. So we'll imagine if you're bleeding, you slice down into the dermis, right? You're below the epidermis, you're into the area that actually has capillaries. So if you imagine kind of slicing through these capillaries that were here, they're going to have to reconnect. So those blood capillaries in that cut area are going to have to reform and reconnect the capillaries on either side. That creates what's called granulation tissue, which is sort of a soft mass. But lots of new capillaries are forming in that granulation tissue area. Macrophages are still at work. They're now removing more tissue, kind of removing the blood clot. So more new epithelial tissue can form right below the scab here. So here's the macrophages taking out that blood clot. That's where new epidermal cells will form. New collagen is being deposited. So collagen helps to strengthen that epithelial tissue and the connective tissue underneath. So more collagen is being deposited. And like I mentioned, these epithelial cells, you can see them on either side of this kind of below the scab. They are going to proliferate and create more. So it fills in this area here where those cells were essentially damaged. So epithelial cells are going to multiply and then migrate to below the scab, where basically there's not really any epithelial cells right now in that image. Down below there, where you have the granulation tissue, so where all of these new blood vessels are forming, that's where the scar actually is. So if you see a scar, it's not necessarily at the surface of the skin, it's actually down a little bit lower in the dermal layer where the capillaries have reformed. That process is called fibrosis. So it's the toughening up of that connective tissue area in the dermis. The inflammation stage will typically last the first few days after an injury, after a cut. And then 3 to 4 days after that injury, the proliferation stage will happen. So new epithelial cells, new blood vessels, all this stuff will start happening 3 to 4 days after the initial cut, and it can last up to 2 weeks. So all of this is happening under your skin, even potentially 2 weeks after you have a cut. And that is all of the proliferation stuff. The maturation phase is actually really easy. There's only basically one thing that happens. The epithelium is just thickening. So we started the process of creating more epithelial cells here under the scab, and now it just continues to thicken during the maturation or remodeling phase. So this epithelial tissue here for you guys on Zoom under the scab is just continuing to thicken, creating more and more layers. This happens obviously after the proliferation phase, so it'll start kind of 2 to 3 weeks after an injury, depending on how severe the cut is. So say if you've had surgery and it's a pretty deep cut, it can take up to 2 years to actually complete the process of remodeling the skin. So if you had surgery less than 2 years ago, that area of your skin might actually still be remodeling itself and kind of thickening that epithelial layer. All right, so those are the stages of wound healing. And that wraps up our integumentary system chapter. So that's everything you need to know, well, for this class anyway, about the skin and its associated organs, glands, etc. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot I have an image here. Let's start that again, but if an image is helpful for you, this just kind of goes through over time. So starting from the cut all the way to the remodeling phase. So that diagram might be helpful as well, in addition to the other slides I had. Okay, so that wraps up chapter 6. All right. Okay. So now we're going to jump into another kind of tissue. So we went over histology, right? So we talked about all the tissues. The skin was mostly the epithelial tissue. We talked about the connective kind of underneath. So that was epithelial and connective tissues. Now we're getting into a specific kind of connective tissue, bone tissue. So we're going to talk for the next few days specifically about this specific kind of connective tissue, because this is going to prepare us to then talk about the skeleton overall. So chapter 7, bone tissue, your outline is due Monday, I believe. So don't forget about that for chapter 7. And then after we get through this, hopefully by Wednesday, then we're actually going to start into learning all of the bones of the skeleton. So 206 bones. This is where the material kind of picks up pace and gets, I would argue, a little bit harder. The histology chapter is pretty tough, but this is where, yeah, people kind of stumble a little bit. The bone tissue chapter, there's a lot of physiology and anatomy that goes into how bone tissue is formed and works. And then memorizing all 206 bones of the body can be pretty tough as well. So lots of material coming up, prepare yourself. This chapter is going to be a lot of me talking, basically. So the bone tissue chapter is a lot of lecturing. When we get into the skeleton in chapter 8, I'll have a few more kind of class activities to break it up a little bit. It gets boring just learning bone after bone after bone, although bone tissue probably too. You could argue that for, but this will be kind of lecture heavy. So try to keep up with where we're at. And if you miss anything on the slides that I'm going over, just remember they're on Canvas, they're accessible. So you can go back and look at the bullet points that I have. So really focus on any note taking, kind of expanding on what I have on the slides already to help you remember or understand this material a little bit better. Okay. So we'll step back a little bit from the specifics of bone tissue and think about the skeleton. So this is, like I said, kind of preparing us to learn more about the skeleton. The skeletal system overall is composed of obviously bones and then cartilage and ligaments. By and large, the biggest part we're going to be talking about is the bones. We just don't have time and brain space probably for now to go into all of the cartilage and the ligaments, but those are pieces that are basically holding the bones together. So they are important. We just don't have time to go into all of them. You already know a lot of the functions of the skeletal system. The first 3 are pretty obvious. The last 3 are probably ones you don't really ever think about your bones doing. So our skeleton obviously helps support us. So we're not just one fleshy mass, like amoeba-like mass moving along the floor so we can stay upright. It's a nice solid foundation for us. It helps protect our internal organs. The rib cage is really important in that perspective. Our cranium helps protect our brain, etc. It also allows for movement. So it allows for attachment points for muscles, which allow us to move. Without those attachment points, it would be sort of hard to move different parts of our body. These last 3 bullet points are really physiologically based. So the top 3 maybe are a little bit more, we'll talk about the anatomy side, like what pieces make up the skeleton. These last 3 I'll talk about, I'll mostly talk about the mineral storage and blood cell production. We won't really talk a whole lot about the acid-base balance, but your bones do obviously store minerals. Calcium and phosphate are the 2 big ones. You know your bones have a lot of calcium and you need calcium to have healthy bones. I'll talk about calcium homeostasis. So calcium is constantly basically being taken out of your bones and into your blood and then going from your blood back into your bones. So it's this balance of calcium between your blood and bones on a daily, hourly basis. On that same note, different elements of bones help to create a pH balance in your body between acids and bases. And your bones are also where blood cells are produced, so specifically in the bone marrow. And this process of blood cell production is called hematopoiesis. So those are the 6 main functions of the skeletal system overall. Again, not quite into the bone tissue part. Focusing on bone tissue, you guys already know it's a connective tissue. It's pretty easy to identify under a slide or under a microscope. And it's kind of a unique connective tissue in that it sort of does solidify, it hardens, which is a process called mineralization or calcification. Both of those terms are kind of used interchangeably. That just means the tissue hardens. Specifically, the matrix of the tissue hardens. So there are cells and fibers within bone tissue. Those don't necessarily harden, it's the matrix around them. So all of that ground substance around the cells essentially is hardening because of calcium phosphate. So I talked about calcium and phosphate being in our bones already, but that molecule in particular, calcium phosphate, along with a few other minerals, is actually helping to harden the matrix. So your cells, your bone cells, are actually trapped inside this solidified matrix. Okay. We probably think our bones are just bone, basically calcium. There's actually quite a few components that make up a bone. So this is a list of all of them. I'll focus on some more than others. The tissue, we're obviously going to focus on a lot. That is the whole point of this chapter. We'll talk about bone marrow a little bit in here. That is primarily in the center of your bones. There's blood, so capillaries enter into your bone tissue. There's cartilage on certain ends of your bones. There's adipose or fatty connective tissue. That kind of helps with shock absorption. You have nerves running into your bones. So nervous tissue along with those blood vessels are actually running through your bones. And then fibrous connective tissue. So just general connective tissue associated with a bone. So I'll be focusing on the first bullet point, bone tissue, a little bit about bone marrow, and then essentially where the blood and nerves come in. I'll mention some cartilage as well. Yeah, so we'll go into detail on a little more detail on some of these aspects, more so than others. But those are the 7 components of bone when you think of a bone. We can divide bones into different categories based on their shape. So the first one here, the first example I have are flat bones. These are the bones of your skull mostly, so they're obviously kind of flat in shape. Your sternum, which is your breastbone, is flat. Your ribs are considered flat. If you look at a rib, it's actually kind of a flat shape. And then your scapula, which is your shoulder blade. That is also a flat bone. When we will look at the skeleton in lab, it'll be a bit more obvious what a flat bone is versus the other shapes that I'll talk about here. All right, so flat bones, long bones are aptly named because they're long. These are pretty much the bones of your limbs. So your arm bones, your leg bones, femur, humerus, radius, ulna, all of those long bones that make up the limbs, along with your digits. So your fingers, your toes, those are typically considered long bones. But when we think of long bones, we think arm and leg for the most part. Short bones are basically bones that are sort of weirdly shaped, but not as weirdly shaped as some others. So I'll bring up the next category too, irregular bones. So irregular bones are really weirdly shaped. Short bones are more or less kind of cube shaped, but they're definitely not long and they're not necessarily flat. So this is mostly the wrist and ankle bones. When we look at the wrist and ankle, you'll see basically 2 different layers of bones that are sort of short and, I don't know, sort of rectangular / cube shaped that make up those connection points between the hand and the leg and the hand and the arm and the foot and the leg. So those are going to be the short bones. You can see here that that's the foot. So the ankle bones. Irregular bones are, for our purposes, primarily the vertebrae. So your spine is made up of these really crazy shaped bones. So this is one vertebral bone, and it doesn't fit into any other category. There's nothing else you can put it in. There's some flat parts, there's some short parts, some kind of longer extensions. So we consider that irregular. Different textbooks and authors sometimes group some of the not as obvious bones into different shape categories. So the pelvis is one, like your hip bones are sometimes considered flat, sometimes considered irregular. So that's why I didn't put them up here. It just kind of depends on the individual author's perspective. But I do want you to know these examples of each of the bones that I've mentioned up here. So these are pretty much always set in these categories. There's one down here on the diagram, a sesamoid bone, which is your kneecap. Don't worry about that term. That's kind of the only one that's that shape. So most of your bones in your body fall into one of these 4 categories. Okay. And a bone typically has 2 sort of layers and 2 different types of bone within it. So there's compact and spongy bone. They are very well described by their names. So compact bone is sort of a dense outer shell. Spongy bone looks spongy. So there's a lot of space in between the individual pieces of spongy bone, which you can see here. And typically what you have depends on the shape of bone you're looking at, but compact bone will be on the outside, spongy bone will be in between layers, sort of like this in the skull of compact bone. So compact bone is sandwiching often spongy bone in between. In long bones, the spongy bone is typically at the ends. So this is an image of the upper part of the femur, your thigh bone. So the spongy bone here is at the end of the bone, where the compact bone kind of runs along the long portion of the bone. By mass, the skeleton is about 3/4 compact bone, 1/4 spongy bone, just for reference. So we're mostly compact bone, at least, yeah, by mass. I'll talk more about the details, at least of spongy bone. I'll go into some details on spongy bone in particular, probably on Monday. But for now, just know that spongy bone is sort of in between an outer layer of compact bone. All right, so I want to talk about long bones here for a few minutes, specifically long bones. They're obviously very important because they're the bones we, I guess, think about most often in our arms and legs. So they have 2 general regions. The middle part, the shaft, is called the diaphysis. So this part here will be the diaphysis. Right in the middle, the long part. The epiphyses are the ends. So they're kind of expanded parts of the bone. The epiphyses are really important for ligament and tendon attachment. So they basically create this surface to allow ligaments and tendons to attach, so muscles and other bones can attach to them. So they're attachment points. In the diaphysis, you have the marrow cavity or the medullary cavity. This is where the bone marrow is found. So running through the center, the shaft of your long bones, you have bone marrow. All right, so diaphysis, epiphyses on either end. In addition to those pieces of the long bone, a couple more important anatomical features of long bones are the articular cartilage and the nutrient foramina. So when something articulates with something else, that's basically indicating some kind of joint. So your femur articulates with your hip bone by basically plugging in to a socket in your hip bone. So the articular part of this cartilage is just saying that there's cartilage at that joint, at that connection between bones. So you can see it up here. There's just a thin layer of cartilage at that upper edge of the femur here, which is where your femur plugs into your hip. It's hyaline cartilage, which is that cartilage that's kind of amorphous, or the matrix is amorphous, sorry, there's cells kind of dotted through this amorphous matrix. It allows for the joint to move a little bit more freely, and then it also absorbs shock. So your femur, the connection point of your femur and your hip bone isn't just bone on bone. There's some cartilage in between there to absorb some shock, which is very important. On to the nutrient foramina. You're going to see this term a lot. Foramina, so this is the plural. The singular version is foramen. They're basically little holes. So anytime you see foramina or foramen, they're tiny little holes in something that we're talking about, usually a bone. There's a bunch in your skull. There's a lot of little holes in your skull. So you'll see foramina and foramen over and over again. So nutrient foramina are little holes that allow nutrients to get into the bone, basically through blood vessels. So here you can see one nutrient foramen, so one hole kind of pierced through the bone, which is where capillary is going to enter the bone, bringing in oxygen along with nutrients. So for you guys on Zoom, here's the nutrient foramen, one entry point for a blood vessel, and you can see down here kind of a blood vessel actually going into the bone at another foramen. So get used to seeing that weird word, foramina or foramen. You'll see it a bunch over the next few weeks. Okay. And then there's a couple of different layers along the bone that you need to be familiar with. First, there's the periosteum, which is just an outer sheath around the bone. So remember, we're talking about long bones specifically. So it's an external sheath. Peri means around. Osteum refers to bone. So an external sheath covering the outside of the bone. It's mostly made of collagen, just to kind of help protect the bone tissue. So it's kind of a protective sheath. The periosteum. And then there's the endosteum. Endo means inside. So the endosteum is going to be another lining, but it's lining that internal marrow cavity. So if you imagine your long bones is kind of hollow in the middle with a marrow cavity running through it, it's lining that internal marrow cavity. So here we see the marrow cavity. The endosteum will be that inner lining right there, basically up against the marrow. So for you guys on Zoom, this lining here along the marrow cavity would be the endosteum. The outside is the periosteum. These terms get really confusing really fast, and a lot of them sound really similar. Okay, those are the two linings that you need to know. And then the last thing about long bones that I want you to be familiar with, and we'll talk about again when we talk about how bones actually grow, is the epiphyseal plate. It's also called the growth plate, indicating that this is where long bones actually grow in length. So when you were 2 years old, your bones were a lot shorter, right, than they are now. The area where your bones grew was specifically at these epiphyseal plates. So at the ends of your long bones, there's these little tiny sections of cartilage. Again, hyaline cartilage. New bone tissue is basically added at that plate, which will allow the bone over a long time to grow in length. So here you can see in this x-ray, this is the lower leg. So the tibia and the fibula. There's a growth plate or an epiphyseal plate on each of those, right, to allow them to grow in length. So here you can see the epiphyseal plate on the tibia and the epiphyseal plate on the fibula. I always do that, tibia and fibula. Once you get to basically about your age, your bones stop growing in length. You don't grow taller after a certain point, right? So your bones don't grow in length anymore. They might grow in width a little bit, but for the most part, the length of your long bones is kind of set by the time you're in your early 20s. So all we have left as adults is the epiphyseal line. So it's no longer a plate. It just becomes basically a scar, and we call it the epiphyseal line. So there's no more active growth in that region after a certain point. Okay, the epiphyseal plate will come up again, so you'll see that term again. But that's the basic idea behind it. It just allows for your bones to grow in length. Okay, and that is where we're going to stop today. So I'll get into flat bones on Monday. Don't forget about your chapter 7 outline. And don't forget about the outline for your disease group video project presentation. So submit that to Canvas, the outline, and then also submit the form for the symposium submission by midnight tonight, or 11:59, I guess, technically. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask me. If you want me to look at an outline, I'm happy to do that before you turn it in, or if you're wondering about what sources to use, etc. So feel free to email me or come by and see me. But yep, we're done for today.